Hello Year 9 and welcome to this whole class feedback video on your 9/11 assessment. This video will be talking through the causes of the attacks just to make sure we've all understood the topic, and then towards the end of the video I will be looking at the work of 9.2 and 9.6. But that being said, this video is still very useful to all of Year 9 that have completed this assessment. Now, the images here of the terrible 9/11 attacks are famous and they're recognisable. The horror of the day itself is very clear. But you were considering what lay behind the attacks and why they happened. It soon became clear that the 9/11 attacks were the work of extremist Muslims from the Middle East. They were acting under the orders from the terrorist called Osama bin Laden. But even though we know who was responsible for the attack and how it was carried out, we still need to understand why it was done in the first place. So your inquiry question was, what caused the 9/11 attacks? And you have looked at underlying long-term causes as well as short-term causes that exacerbated tension and eventually triggered the devastating attack. Now, I really like this analogy, sort of metaphor to describe causation. So, like the roots of a tree, the causes of major historical events go deep and wide. They are often tangled together and it is not clear which ones matter most. So it was your job as historians to try and disentangle all the causes and work out what you thought was the main cause for the 9/11 attacks. So before you began to unpick and disentangle the causes of these attacks, you looked at what the attacks actually were and you defined terrorism. So here we have an example of pupil work doing that very thing. So feel free to pause the video to have a read of that. Now, the roots of this event can be traced all the way back to the late 19th century, and they can be summarised as a desire for profit really. Now, the Middle East was largely ignored for hundreds of years by Western Europe and Americans. But when this canal here, the Suez Canal, opened in 1869, it made trade between Britain, who's around here, and India much quicker and more profitable, because Britain now didn't have to go all the way round Africa. It could cut through here to get to India, and it was a much safer route. So they could get to that part of their empire easily and they could continue to make money. You will have read that this region the Gulf region became very important to America and Britain when oil was discovered in the early 20th century, so around 1908. Western countries began to interfere in the Muslim Middle East once oil was discovered in 1908 in Persia, modern Iran. Now, the main power in the Middle East was the Ottoman Empire in 1914, but after World War I, by 1918, they had been defeated. They had been fighting with the Germans, so they therefore became enemies of the British and their allies, America and the French. Because they had lost, their fate was to be decided by the victors, Britain, France and America. And this was decided at something called the Paris Peace Conference. You have learnt about this conference before when you studied the Treaty of Versailles, but we've only looked at the fate of Germany. So this is what happened to the Middle East. The Middle East was divided into 5 countries called mandates, and that meant that they would be ruled by another country, in this case Britain and France, who would supposedly prepare them for self-rule. There was another complicated factor. Now, one of Britain's mandates in the Middle East was Palestine, and Arthur Balfour was the British Foreign Secretary, and in order to get support from the Jewish community during World War I, he promised that Palestine could be a national home for the Jewish people. Now, the history of this goes all the way back to 70 AD, when the Jewish community were pushed out by the Romans. If you would like to read a bit more about this and the history of the Zionist movement, then I will attach a link to a document which will extend your knowledge even further. The Balfour Declaration, which was the promise that the Jews could have a home, a national home in Palestine. Now, this caused much anger because 95% of those living in Palestine were not Jewish, they were Muslim. Now, in the 1930s, Jewish migration continued and it increased to British-controlled Palestine. This caused tension and between the Jews and the Arab communities. The reason it increased during the 1930s and after World War II was because of the Holocaust and the persecution of the Jewish communities, which encouraged their movement to and their rush to Palestine. Britain tried to stop the migration, but this led to more violence. So in 1947, Britain decided to get the United Nations to help decide the future of Palestine. The UN suggested dividing Palestine into two countries, one Arab and one Jewish. Arab leaders refused this offer and they continued to call the country Palestine. Jewish leaders, which were now supported by the USA, accepted and they called their new country Israel. Now, the USA supported the Jews because they had a lot of Jews living in America. Israel was a democracy, they liked that because it was similar to them, and Arab states were actually quite friendly with America's great enemy, the Soviet Union. So when you've looked at the Cold War, there's some links there. So they didn't want to support them because they were friends with their enemy. Why might these events lead to Muslims becoming angry with Western powers? So there's lots of different complex events, but ultimately it's an interference and control which causes this anti-Western feeling. In 1948, neighbouring Arab countries attacked Israel to destroy the new nation, but Israel won and took even more land. 500,000 Palestinians fled their homes to live in refugee camps, often populating Jordan, Egypt and Syria. Ever since 1949, most Muslim nations have supported the Palestinians and accused the West of favouring and being biased to Israel. Here's a map of the territory. In 1952, the monarchy of Egypt was overthrown and led by Gamal Abdel Nasser. Muslim Brotherhood, a fundamentalist Islamic organisation, was opposed to Nasser because the Republic under Nasser developed closer cooperation with the West. In 1954, the Brotherhood was blamed for an assassination attempt on Nasser. It was therefore banned and many members were imprisoned and tortured. During the 50s and 60s, the leading member of the Brotherhood, Sayyid Qutb, played an important role in deepening some Muslims' hatred of the West. Qutb was appalled by the aspects of American society and culture, like gun violence, for example. In his books, Qutb stated that anything that was non-Muslim was evil and corrupt. Here is a picture of him in prison. In 1966, Qutb was executed for plotting to assassinate Nasser, but his writing actually led to a more radical and violent form of Islam, which then influenced people like Osama bin Laden. Now, Osama bin Laden was a young Saudi Arabian, and he was angry that Israel could not be defeated. When he was at university, he followed the teachings of extreme Arab nationalists and he called for a violent jihad, which is a struggle against weak Muslim leaders and non-Muslim they called infidel powers, and he called them enemies of Islam. These included Israel and the USA. Now, these all represent long-term causes which contributed to underlying tension and mistrust. Here we have some examples of student work, which is completing the timeline and defining those key terms that you needed throughout the inquiry. So I mentioned fundamentalist here, and this pupil has rightly defined this as a person who believes in the strict literal interpretation of a scripture in a religion. For your next task, you had to continue the timeline to track the causes. And here we start with the late 1960s to 1996. So here we have the spread of extremism, so extreme fundamentalist views. After the execution of Sayyid Qutb, many members of the Muslim Brotherhood moved to Saudi Arabia because they feared that they might also be executed. Saudi Arabia followed a strict form of Islam and accepted the views of the Muslim Brotherhood. One of the people who moved to Saudi Arabia was Mohammed Qutb, Sayyid's younger brother, and his job as professor of Islamic studies meant that the ideas of the Brotherhood could reach a wider audience, as I mentioned, including the student Osama bin Laden. Now, this converges here with the Cold War. The Soviet Union in 1979 invaded Afghanistan, which is a Muslim country. Around 250,000 men in Afghanistan joined the Mujahideen. Now, these were guerrilla fighters determined to push out the Russian communists and protect Islam in Afghanistan. The Mujahideen were financed and armed by the Saudis, who wanted to protect Islam, and the Americans, who hated communists, also funded this group of guerrilla fighters, which will become very important later on. 2,000 men in the Mujahideen were foreign fighters, including many men from Saudi Arabia. One of these young fighters was Osama bin Laden, who used his wealth to finance the Mujahideen. In 1988, Al-Qaeda was formed. By the late 1980s, the Mujahideen had succeeded in stopping the Soviet forces, and the Soviets slowly retreated from Afghanistan. Spurred on by their success, the foreign members of the Mujahideen wanted to expand their violent struggle into other parts of the world. A number of new fundamentalist Islamic organisations were formed to carry on the fight. One of these was Al-Qaeda, which began in 1988 and was financed by Osama bin Laden. So the group that had been funded by the Saudi Arabians and the Americans was now spiralling and forming into Al-Qaeda. In 1990, Saddam Hussein, the dictator of Iraq, invaded the neighbouring country of Kuwait. Now, Kuwait was a small country, but it was crucial for oil, and it supplied oil to the rest of the world. Remember, oil was the first reason, one of the long-term reasons that the West even got involved in the Middle East. Iraq was a long-term enemy of Saudi Arabia, and the invasion of Kuwait meant that the Iraqi troops were in striking distance of the Saudi oil fields. Bin Laden offered his Mujahideen troops to the Saudi government to fight the Iraqis. His offer was declined. Instead, the Saudis allowed the USA and allied forces to lead the attack on Iraq. This infuriated and disgusted bin Laden because the Americans were proudly displaying their flag in his home country. He criticised the King of Saudi Arabia, and because of that criticism, he was expelled from the country. 1996, Al-Qaeda is then kicked out of Sudan. Now, in 1995, terrorists attempted to assassinate President Mubarak of Egypt. Some people think these were Al-Qaeda terrorists. The Egyptians instantly blamed the Sudanese government for supporting the terrorists. The Sudanese government realised that they needed to make a gesture to the Egyptians to quell the tension, or because they would face punishment in the form of military attack. As a result, in 1996, bin Laden and Al-Qaeda were kicked out of Sudan. After being expelled from Sudan and banned from Saudi Arabia, bin Laden had only one place he could go: Afghanistan. Following the withdrawal of Soviet troops from Afghanistan in 1988, there had been a bitter civil war that had lasted for 4 years. A fundamentalist Islamic group called the Taliban gradually took over the country. It was led by many of the Mujahideen who had fought alongside bin Laden in the 1980s. In 1996, the Taliban leader, Mohammed Omar, offered Al-Qaeda protection in Afghanistan. From this base, Al-Qaeda grew in strength, hidden from the rest of the world. By the later 1990s, the communist threat to Islam began to decrease because the Soviet Union had collapsed. Bin Laden's hatred now focused entirely on the USA. In 1998, he issued a fatwa, which was an Islamic ruling, and he called for the killing of Americans who he blamed for all the problems in the Middle East. Now, from their base in Afghanistan, Al-Qaeda began training soldiers to commit acts of terrorism. Many of these soldiers were trained to be suicide bombers. This was a relatively new technique, and it was highly effective as it meant terrorists could conceal bombs on themselves and get close to the targets before the bomb was detonated. The young men who trained to become suicide bombers were promised they would become Islamic martyrs and go straight to heaven. On the 7th of August 1998, the US embassies in Kenya and Tanzania were attacked simultaneously. At 10:30 a.m, suicide bombers parked trucks with explosives next to the two embassies and detonated the bomb. 224 people were killed. Because Al-Qaeda's attack on the US embassies had shown that a well-planned suicide attack involving just a few individuals could have a devastating impact. Now Al-Qaeda turned its attention to planning a direct attack on the USA. 19 terrorists from different countries were selected for the task. These young men were all committed to an extreme form of Islam, which saw Western values as evil. They were carefully planned attacks using the power of the internet. Their targets were iconic buildings that, to them, represented the greed and power of the West. So now I'm going to talk through your answers to this question, what caused the 9/11 attacks? Now, this topic is really important because it helps you understand the world today, but it draws so many links to topics we've already done. So just in that brief summary there, I was talking about empire, trade, World War II, the Holocaust. There are so many links, but it's also important because it's a topic which works on your causal writing and your causal understanding, which will be really important for you as historians. Beth's sentence here was really good for showing the interplay and the linking between events, because she said each of these played an important role. If one hadn't have happened, then the attacks wouldn't have happened because there would have been no tension. So it's really important to show the sort of complexity of how these causes work together. Charlotte's sentence here, really simple but really powerful. However, the most important cause of 9/11 was, so however shows that Charlotte has addressed an alternative argument, but here she is reinforcing her argument. Angel, by identification of a long-term cause here, with the underlying cause of tension being the discovery of oil in 1908. Jack, great sentence here, talking about the war in Kuwait, which exacerbated events. Fantastic. Another great one from Jack, talking about the increasing anger of Osama bin Laden and his determination and outrage, which propelled him to want to get revenge. I just thought that was a really powerful sentence. Jack, a really great generalisation which captures the complexity. So starting your essay with, I think the main reasons that caused 9/11 were suspicion, hatred and greed. 3 words which capture so much in this entangled web of what causes the 9/11 attacks. Millie, maintaining of your judgment in your introduction, throughout the essay and then in the conclusion, whilst also addressing another viewpoint, an alternative viewpoint to your own. What was fantastic about Millie's essay was the way in which she embedded the historian Lawrence Wright's argument in her essay to drive it forward. Lily, great use of trigger to show the importance of the attacks on the embassies, implanting the seed for the plans for 9/11. Isabel, just fantastic links between paragraphs. It flowed beautifully, and you also sustained your judgment throughout and in your introduction and conclusion. Teresa, just a really powerful sentence here. It is just a lot of long-term causes that led to a dreadful tragedy. So really capturing the longevity of this. It isn't just something that happens a few months or a year before. It is a set of long-term causes which connect with one another. Ben, this could also be a long-term cause because this hatred for the USA had started many years ago, and it carried on all the way to 2001 when the tragedy happened. Very similar there to Teresa, just fantastic acknowledgement of the long-term causes building and building, leading to the dreadful event. Edie, really great sentence again, similar in many ways to Jack's. They got power hungry at this stage and now wanted revenge. Just really great stance to take on the answer, just being bold enough to say, look, this country got power hungry and that led to this. Really fantastic. Now, misconceptions or misunderstandings, often slipping into what I've called here a shapeless narrative. So that's simply just telling me what happens. Your narratives had a lovely shape when you indicated what cause or what role each cause played and what your view was. So causal arguments need to drive your answer. So using words like or phrases, another reason which exacerbated, that would drive your narrative, your answer. Another aspect which often crops up is needing to write like a historian, not using phrases like didn't or wouldn't, so not being casual in your language, making sure you're writing formally, and write with certainty and clarity. By that I mean, I don't want to see phrases like I believe or I think or probably or this could have. Be certain. History is not necessarily a matter of belief. It is evidence and argument, so be confident with it. And just checking the appropriate use of capital letters for proper nouns, for example. I know there are a lot of new terms, so that may have slipped under the radar a bit, but just checking through your work and making those changes. So spag, cropping up again, would have, could have, should have. Remember it's would have, should have, could have. Blamed, and then Al-Qaeda, the spelling there. Remembering causal language, a lot of you did this fantastically well, but just reminding you, just some examples you could have used. The root cause, something that's underlying, so long term. Fueling, so enhancing or making it more likely, adding fuel to it. Nurturing, so like creating the tension. Inciting, so encouraging something. Exacerbating, you used really well. And then eventually the trigger or the spark. What I'd like you to do is go back through your essays and then see if you can make sure that you have driven your answer with the causal argument. You haven't slipped into clumsy, casual writing, you're writing with certainty. If you've used the phrase I believe or I think, just cross that out with your green pen neatly and make sure you are writing with certainty, and then check your capital letters and your spelling. For this assessment, my top historian has to be Teresa for your sustained argument and causal language. You wrote with confidence and had a real command of the evidence. But all of you produced fantastic essays, and I would love to have included examples from every single one of you because you all did something that was absolutely wonderful. So well done, Year 9.